it's hard to argue that Minecraft isn't the most influential game of the past 20 years or so, if not one of the most influential games ever. Minecraft's immense success spawned wave after wave of imitators and innovators, many of which have gone on to become juggernauts in their own right. And even outside of the open world survival genre, it's getting kind of difficult to find a game that can't thank Minecraft for some part of its design philosophy. Valheim, of course, is no different, clearly borrowing from the games that came before it. But Valheim seems to learn all the right lessons from where other games went wrong, remastering the fundamentals and bringing in a heavy dose of Norse mythology instead of going all in on a single ambitious gameplay gimmick like so many other games do. But how do you iterate on mechanics that have been done so many times? It all seems to come down to positive reinforcement. Valheim respects the player's time and rewards the player for exploring each aspect of the game thoroughly, forming a cohesive gameplay loop where it rarely feels like you're just wasting your time. Let's look at the way that Valheim handles food as an example. Obviously, food collection is an essential component of most survival games. You have a hunger bar. That hunger bar depletes over time, and if you don't eat often enough, you'll die. Now, this happens to me in real life, so this simplistic approach does have a certain amount of realism to it, but as anybody that has to make dinner every night can tell you, it doesn't really add to the fun in a meaningful way. Valheim takes that mechanic and turns it around. You don't have a hunger bar, and technically you could play the entire game without eating anything, but instead what you do have is a strong incentive to eat. This is because food temporarily increases your maximum HP and stamina, making every other aspect of the game easier. Cooking becomes an opportunity to make your character significantly stronger, rather than a chore that you get punished for not doing. But Valheim doesn't give you every recipe up front. Instead, recipes are added to your crafting list as you find the required materials, both for food and for every other craftable item in the game. You're encouraged to engage with every aspect of your environment because everything from the smallest flower to the biggest tree could be a complete game changer hidden in plain sight. Even the window dressing serves a purpose, which is a principle that extends to base building. If I had to describe Valheim's base building in a single sentence, I would probably refer to it as Ark's building system if it was designed by people that knew how to make video games. The third-person camera makes seeing what you're building a lot easier, material costs are low enough that making a new building isn't a grind that you dread, and perhaps most importantly, the snap points actually work. The game provides you with a ton of parts to build whatever you can imagine, and it can get quite impressive. But even if you can't imagine much, it's surprisingly easy to make a decent looking house. But while you're certainly free to keep your base as a beacon of minimalism, Valheim cleverly rewards players that commit some extra time to base building. This is because houses in Valheim give the Rested buff, which is a powerful temporary buff that boosts stamina and health regen, as well as boosting the rate that your skills level up at. Now, to access this buff, all you need is an enclosed area with a campfire nearby, but the buff's duration scales with the comfort level of your house, which is a stat that is boosted by furniture and other related cosmetic items, providing a real tangible benefit to players that are willing to take the time to make their base look nice. Now, even as somebody that typically lives in a hole in the side of a hill every time I play Minecraft, the extended Rested buff is a bit too good to pass up, and Valheim is the first survival game in years where I have spent an entire afternoon just decorating my house and building. Once you do get exploring, each biome is both visually and mechanically different, keeping gameplay fresh and progression snappy. While some materials can be difficult to acquire, the game doesn't make a habit of artificially dialing up the grind to keep you playing for longer. Even once you start to stray further and further from the world's spawn point, the game provides you with the tools to make fast travel portals, preventing the need for hours of repetitive sailing between islands and streamlining the exploration process. These fast travel portals are efficient, but don't allow certain raw materials through, meaning that even in a well-explored world, the most thematically appropriate method of travel remains relevant, both when exploring new areas and when transporting cargo and loot. At the center of the exploration process is a series of boss fights. Each biome has its own boss, which matches the theme of the biome and typically drops an item that helps progress further through the game. Combat is enjoyable with a wide variety of weapons, armor, and combat items available from pretty early on, but as somebody that enjoys the immersion factor of open world games in a first-person perspective, the third-person camera was a bit of an adjustment. And while I've mostly grown used to it in the majority of circumstances, the biggest sore spot in the game as it is right now is probably fighting on any sort of uneven terrain. Weapons tend to aim directly in front of you, making hitting enemies slightly above or slightly below you a massive pain, and leaving an otherwise well done combat system feeling a bit clunky occasionally. Thankfully, Valheim isn't actually a particularly punishing game in my experience. Items are recoverable after death, no matter how long you take to get back to them. Though you do lose some stats on death, the game gives you some buffs in exchange, preventing you from losing more stats on repeated deaths and helping you get away safely once your stuff has been retrieved. Personally, I have found that some precautions, like having a backup boat on standby and making portals on each new island, will save you a lot of time, especially in the early game. However, this does allow Valheim to be fairly punishing with its enemy design. From pretty early on, there will be enemies that one-shot you, enemies that poison you for your entire health bar, and occasionally even enemies that will aggro onto your boat from outside of their render distance, which I am not a fan of. But for the most part, Valheim rewards planning above all else, and almost always gives you the tools to surmount any obstacle you face. Of course, pleasant aesthetics and a strong theme play a pretty large role in Valheim's success as well. Perhaps the greatest lesson to be learned from Minecraft is how well retro graphics age. Sure, Minecraft wasn't winning any realism awards the first time I saw it in 2010, but I would seriously struggle to think of any games from that era that hold up as well 15 years later, and Valheim has gone all in on a similar strategy with low-res textures and simplistic models. The game's charming, simplistic look is potentially held back by a few clumsy animations here and there, but generally speaking, you don't have to worry about Valheim aging poorly, and more importantly, in the short term, you don't need to shell out the big bucks to run the game at an appropriate FPS. What's fascinating to me about Valheim is that despite everything positive I've said about it, it didn't click at all when I first played it several years ago, and it's only recently that I've begun to appreciate the game's design. The game is greater than the sum of its parts, and relatively unambitious compared to some of its competitors, but the end result is a much more polished game than the rough around the edges presentation would make you think, even in early access. The game has a unique charm, building a world that you genuinely want to be in. Of course, I'd be lying if I said my love for Viking-inspired media didn't play a role in my newfound love for this game, but it's not a title I'd be surprised to find myself revisiting frequently on the channel. Though I've played the game enough to feel comfortable reviewing it as a pretty casual player, I don't feel particularly rushed to beat the game, and since I've been taking my time with it, I still find myself at probably the midway point, having just entered the plains. I haven't stepped foot in either the Mistlands or any of the new Ashlands update, both of which seem to be quite expansive, so be on the lookout for more videos as I progress further, especially if this video does fairly well.